On the day of my grandson's baptism, my daughter-in-law texted me, "Want to make a difference in your grandson's life? Disappear forever." So I did as she asked. Until the greedy one's rent came due. I think you forgot the deposit. Subscribe to the channel for more stories like this, and comment the city you're watching from. The morning of my grandson's baptism started like any other Sunday, but it would end as the day that changed everything between my family and me. I woke up early, as I always do, and spent an hour pressing the navy blue dress I'd bought specifically for this occasion. My hands trembled slightly as I hung it on the closet door. Not from age but from excitement. After 18 months of being a grandmother, I was finally going to see little Matthew receive his first blessing. I should have known something was wrong when David, my son, called the night before with such specific instructions about the timing. "Mom, just meet us at the church at 10 sharp, okay? Skylar has everything organized perfectly. And you know how she gets when things don't go according to plan." His voice carried that familiar tone of walking on eggshells, the same one he'd developed since marrying her 3 years ago. At 61, I'd learned to pick my battles with Skylar, my daughter-in-law. She had a way of making me feel like an intruder in my own son's life, but I told myself it was just new mother nerves. Every woman wants to protect her family, right? I convinced myself that once Matthew got older, things would settle down between us. The drive to St. Michael's took 25 minutes, and I spent every one of them rehearsing what I'd say to the other family members. I hadn't seen most of David's in-laws since the wedding, and I wanted to make a good impression. Skylar always complained that I was too quiet at family gatherings, so I prepared several conversation starters about Matthew's milestones, and even looked up some current events to discuss. I arrived at exactly 10 o'clock, just as David had instructed. The parking lot was already full, and I could see clusters of well-dressed people heading toward the church entrance. My heart swelled seeing all these loved ones gathered to celebrate my grandson's special day. I checked my appearance one last time in the rearview mirror, applied a fresh coat of lipstick, and grabbed the carefully wrapped baptism gift from the passenger seat. The gift had taken me weeks to choose. It was a silver picture frame engraved with Matthew's first blessing and today's date. Inside, I'd placed a photo of David from his own baptism 28 years ago, hoping to create a connection between father and son. I imagined Skylar placing it on Matthew's dresser, and maybe years from now my grandson would ask about the baby in the picture and learn about his father's childhood. As I walked up the church steps, I spotted Skylar's parents, Robert and Linda, near the entrance. They were dressed impeccably, as always, and surrounded by what looked like their entire extended family. Linda caught my eye and gave me a polite smile, the kind reserved for distant acquaintances rather than fellow grandparents. "Helen, you look lovely," she said, though her eyes barely met mine before scanning the crowd behind me. "David and Skylar are inside getting Matthew ready. You should probably find a seat." Something in her tone made me pause, but I nodded and headed inside. The church was packed, much fuller than I'd expected. I walked down the center aisle, looking for David and Skylar in the front pews where family typically sits during baptisms. Instead, I found them surrounded entirely by Skylar's relatives, with no empty space anywhere near them. I stood there for a moment, clutching my purse and the gift, feeling suddenly out of place. A woman I didn't recognize was holding Matthew, cooing at him while Skylar fussed with his tiny white outfit. David was deep in conversation with Robert about something that made them both laugh. No one noticed me standing there. "Excuse me, are you looking for somewhere to sit?" An elderly usher appeared beside me, his voice kind but curious. "The ceremony is about to begin. I'm the baby's grandmother," I said, gesturing toward the front pew. "David is my son." The usher looked confused, glancing between me and the family gathered at the front. "Oh well, let me see what I can arrange." He started walking toward David, but I stopped him. Something about this whole situation felt wrong, and I didn't want to cause a scene by forcing my way into a space where I clearly wasn't expected. I found an empty spot in a pew about halfway back and settled in, telling myself that maybe this was better anyway. From here, I'd have a clear view of the ceremony without feeling like I was intruding. But as the service began, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was watching my own family from the outside, like a stranger who'd wandered into someone else's celebration. The baptism itself was beautiful. Father Martinez spoke about family, love, and the importance of community in raising a child. Matthew was perfectly behaved, barely crying when the holy water touched his forehead. I watched David hold his son with such tenderness, and my heart ached with pride and something else I couldn't quite name. During the prayers, I found myself studying Skylar. At 26, she possessed the kind of effortless beauty that had captivated my son from their first meeting. Her blonde hair was styled in perfect waves, her makeup flawless despite having an 18-month-old to care for. She held herself with the confidence of someone who'd never doubted her place in the world. As I watched her interact with her family, laughing at inside jokes and accepting congratulations, I realized something that made my chest tighten. She looked genuinely happy, completely in her element, surrounded by people who clearly adored her. The only time her expression shifted was when her eyes accidentally met mine across the church. For just a second, her smile faltered, replaced by something colder. After the ceremony, everyone gathered in the church hall for refreshments. I approached David first, hoping to finally hold my grandson and take some pictures. The service was beautiful, sweetheart. Matthew was such a good baby. David beamed with parental pride. Thanks, Mom. I can't believe how well he did. Not a single meltdown. He started to shift Matthew in his arms, and I thought he was going to hand him to me, but Skylar appeared beside him with perfect timing. David, your cousin wants to take some pictures with Matthew before he gets fussy, she said smoothly, already reaching for the baby. And your mom probably wants to get some cake before it's all gone, right, Helen? The dismissal was polite but unmistakable. David, oblivious as usual to his wife's subtle manipulations, nodded enthusiastically. Oh, definitely get some cake, Mom. Skylar picked out this amazing bakery. I watched them walk away, Skylar's hand possessively on David's arm, Matthew safely out of my reach. Around me, other grandparents were taking turns holding babies, snapping photos, being included in the joy of the moment. I stood alone with my untouched piece of cake, feeling more isolated than I had since my husband died 5 years ago. The drive home passed in a blur of hurt feelings and confused thoughts. I kept replaying the day, trying to identify exactly when things had gone wrong. Maybe I should have been more assertive about sitting with the family. Maybe I should have spoken up when Skylar redirected David away from me. Maybe I was being too sensitive about the whole thing. By the time I reached my small apartment, I'd almost convinced myself that I was overreacting. Skylar was young, probably overwhelmed by hosting such a big event. David was focused on being a good father and husband. These things happen at family gatherings. Tomorrow things would be back to normal. Then I checked my phone and found the text message that would shatter every excuse I'd made for them. The sender was Skylar, and the timestamp showed she'd sent it while I was still at the church, probably while I was eating that piece of cake she'd suggested I go get. Want to make a difference in your grandson's life? Disappear forever. I read it 3 times, certain I must be misunderstanding something. But there was no ambiguity in those 9 words. No room for misinterpretation. My daughter-in-law, the mother of my only grandchild, wanted me gone from their lives completely. My hand shook as I set the phone down on my kitchen counter. The silver picture frame, still in its gift wrap, sat beside it like a monument to my foolishness. I'd spent months looking forward to this day, imagining it would be the beginning of a closer relationship with my growing family. Instead, it was apparently the day I'd been officially uninvited from my grandson's life. The silence in my apartment felt different than usual, heavier somehow. For the first time since becoming a grandmother, I wondered if maybe Skylar was right. Maybe Matthew would be better off without me. But as I sat there in my kitchen, still wearing my navy blue dress and holding that cruel text message, one thought kept nagging at the back of my mind. How had Skylar gotten so confident that she could treat me this way? What made her so certain that she held all the power in this relationship? I was about to find out that her confidence was built on a foundation she didn't even know existed. The weeks after Matthew's baptism stretched into months, each day blending into the next in a haze of deliberate absence. I did exactly what Skylar had demanded in that text message. I disappeared. Not physically from the world but from their world, which had apparently never truly included me anyway. The hardest part wasn't the silence from David, though that cut deep enough. The hardest part was discovering how easily my absence was explained away. Through my sister Margaret, who stayed in touch with some of David's old friends, I learned the story Skylar had crafted about my sudden withdrawal from their lives. She said you decided you needed space to focus on yourself, Margaret reported during one of our weekly coffee meetings at the diner near her house. That you felt overwhelmed by grandparent responsibilities and wanted to step back while Matthew was still young. I stirred my coffee mechanically, watching the cream swirl into brown spirals that reminded me of the confusion clouding my thoughts. She made it sound like my choice. From what I heard, she told people you said being a grandmother brought back too many difficult memories of raising David alone after his father left. Margaret's voice carried the careful neutrality she used when delivering particularly painful news. Everyone seemed to think it was very mature of you to recognize your limitations. The brilliance of Skylar's lie was in its believability. I had raised David as a single mother after my husband walked out when our son was 12. Those had been difficult years, filled with financial stress, long work hours, and the constant worry that I wasn't enough for my growing boy. It would make perfect sense that becoming a grandmother might trigger those old anxieties. Except it didn't. Watching David become a father had been one of the purest joys of my life. A chance to see the loving, capable man he'd grown into despite the challenges of his childhood. But Skylar had taken that narrative and twisted it into something that painted me as fragile, overwhelmed, and ultimately selfish for prioritizing my own emotional needs over my grandson's. The worst part was imagining David accepting this explanation. Had he felt relieved when Skylar told him I needed space? Had he been secretly grateful not to have to navigate the complicated dynamics he always seemed to find so stressful? The thought made my chest ache with a different kind of pain than the sharp sting of that text message. Spring turned to summer, and summer faded into fall. I developed new routines to fill the spaces where my family used to be. Tuesday morning grocery shopping instead of the Thursday afternoon trips, when I might run into other grandmothers discussing their weekend babysitting plans. Evening walks through the park near my apartment instead of the children's playground where I'd hoped to push Matthew on the swings someday. Social media became both my lifeline and my torture. Skylar posted constantly about their perfect little family. Matthew taking his first steps while clutching David's fingers. Matthew's first Halloween costume. A tiny pumpkin that made him look edible with cuteness. Matthew's first birthday party. An elaborate affair with a theme that must have cost more than I spent on groceries in 2 months. Each photo was captioned with variations of the same sentiment. Our little family is complete. All the love we need right here. When you have everything you could want. The message was clear to anyone who might wonder where David's mother was in all these milestone moments. They didn't need me, and more importantly, they didn't want me. But it was the photos from David's birthday in October that finally broke through my carefully constructed emotional detachment. Skylar had thrown him a surprise party. Judging from the pictures of his genuinely shocked expression, as he walked into what looked like their apartment filled with friends and decorations. Everyone was there. Skylar's parents and siblings, David's old college buddies, co-workers I recognized from the few company picnics I'd attended over the years. I scrolled through image after image of my son celebrating another year of life, surrounded by people who cared about him. The cake was his favorite chocolate with peanut butter frosting, the kind I'd made for him every year until Skylar entered the picture and started hiring professional bakers. Someone had put together a slideshow of photos from David's childhood, and I could see glimpses of pictures I'd taken displayed on their television screen. My photos of my son, shown at a party I hadn't been invited to, celebrating a birthday I hadn't been allowed to acknowledge. That night, I did something I hadn't done since the weeks immediately after the baptism. I cried. Not the quiet, dignified tears of someone processing grief, but the ugly, choking sobs of someone who'd finally run out of ways to pretend everything was okay. When I was done crying, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat down at my kitchen table with a notepad. If I was going to be erased from their lives, I wanted to understand exactly how complete that erasure was. I started making a list of all the ways I'd been connected to David and his new family, all the threads that had once woven me into their daily existence. The list was longer than I'd expected. Weekly phone calls that had dwindled to nothing. Holiday traditions that no longer included me. The emergency contact forms where David had once listed my information. The spare key to their apartment that I'd returned after one too many comments from Skylar about privacy and boundaries. But as I wrote, I started remembering things that weren't on Skylar's radar. Connections she didn't know existed because they'd been established before she came into the picture. The security deposit I'd co-signed for David's first apartment after college, the one they still lived in because it was rent-controlled and in a good neighborhood. The furniture I'd helped him buy when he moved in, purchased with my credit card because his was maxed out from student loans. The car insurance policy where I'd added David as a secondary driver to help him get better rates. An arrangement that had never been changed even after he got married. The savings account I'd opened for him as a graduation gift, with both our names on it in case he ever needed emergency access to funds. These weren't gifts or loans that had been repaid and forgotten. These were ongoing financial entanglements that kept me legally and practically connected to the life Skylar was so determined to protect from my influence. As I stared at my list, a strange calm settled over me. For months, I'd been operating under the assumption that Skylar held all the cards in whatever game we were playing. She had David's loyalty, Matthew's daily presence, and the power to control the narrative about my absence from their lives. But power, I realized, isn't just about who people love more or who gets to hold the baby at family gatherings. Sometimes power is about who pays the bills, who signs the contracts, and who has legal rights that can't be wished away by a cruel text message. I finished my wine and put the notepad in my kitchen drawer. Tomorrow, I would start making some phone calls to understand exactly what kind of connections I still had to my son's life, whether Skylar knew about them or not. For the first time since Matthew's baptism, I fell asleep with something other than sadness weighing on my mind. It was curiosity, mixed with the faint stirring of something I'd almost forgotten how to feel. It might have been hope, but it felt a lot like power. The next morning brought the first hint of winter chill, and a phone call from David that caught me completely off guard. I was drinking my coffee and reading through some old bank statements when his name appeared on my caller ID. For a moment I just stared at it, wondering if I was hallucinating. "Hi, Mom." His voice sounded strained, tired in a way that made me instantly worried about his health. "David, is everything okay? Is Matthew all right?" "Everyone's fine, Mom. He paused, and I could hear Skylar's voice in the background, though I couldn't make out the words. "I was wondering if you wanted to have lunch sometime this week. Just the two of us." My heart jumped, but something in his tone made me cautious. This didn't sound like a son who missed his mother. This sounded like a man following a script. "I'd love that, sweetheart. Is there something special you wanted to talk about?" Another pause, longer this time. "We just thought it might be good to catch up. It's been a while." Not I. We thought it might be good. As I agreed to meet him at a restaurant near his office on Friday, I found myself wondering what had changed. Why, after months of complete silence, was I suddenly being invited back into contact? What did they need from me that couldn't be accomplished through continued avoidance? By the time I hung up, my cautious hope had hardened into something sharper. Whatever they wanted, I had a feeling it was going to cost them more than they expected. The restaurant David chose for our lunch was one of those modern places with exposed brick walls and artisanal everything. The kind of spot that charges $18 for a sandwich and calls it elevated comfort food. I arrived 15 minutes early, partly from nervous energy and partly because I wanted to observe him before he saw me. I needed to understand what version of my son would walk through that door. He looked tired when he finally appeared, scanning the crowded dining room until his eyes found mine. The David who approached my corner table was thinner than I remembered, his usually crisp work shirts hanging a little loose around his shoulders. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his hair needed cutting. This wasn't the glowing new father from Skylar's social media posts. "Hi, Mom." He leaned down to give me an awkward hug, the kind reserved for distant relatives at funerals. "Thanks for meeting me." "Of course, sweetheart. You look like you haven't been sleeping well. Is Matthew still waking up at night?" David's laugh had no humor in it. "Something like that." He slid into the seat across from me, immediately busying himself with the menu as if memorizing every appetizer description would help him avoid eye contact. We ordered our food in the stilted politeness of strangers, discussing the weather and his work with the careful neutrality of people who'd forgotten how to be family. I waited, letting him lead the conversation wherever it needed to go, because I could see something building behind his careful composure. "Mom, I need to ask you about something," he finally said after our salads arrived. His fork moved lettuce around his plate without actually eating any of it. "Skylar and I, we're having some issues with our apartment situation. There it was. The real reason for this lunch invitation disguised as maternal reconciliation. I took a careful bite of my sandwich and waited for him to continue. The landlord is saying there's a problem with our lease. Something about the security deposit and the guarantor paperwork. David's words came out in a rush, like he'd been rehearsing them. He's threatening to make us reapply for the apartment, which would mean a credit check and a much higher deposit than we can afford right now. I set down my sandwich and looked directly at my son. What kind of problem with the guarantor paperwork? David's face flushed red. That's what I was hoping you might know something about. The landlord mentioned that the original guarantor might be withdrawing from the agreement, but we don't understand what that means. Skylar's parents never co-signed anything, and I don't remember signing up for a guarantor when we moved in. The moment stretched between us, filled with the clatter of dishes and conversations from other tables. My son, 28 years old, married and a father, had no idea that his mother had been financially responsible for his housing for the past 4 years. The security deposit, the guarantor agreement, the reason he'd been able to afford that beautiful rent-controlled apartment in the first place, all of it had been my doing. And Skylar, who'd spent months crafting the narrative of my voluntary absence from their lives, had no clue that her perfect little family's stability depended on the woman she'd told to disappear forever. David, I said gently, do you remember when you first moved into that apartment? Right after you graduated from college. Of course. It was such a great find, especially for the price. The landlord said I qualified because of my steady job, even though my credit wasn't perfect yet. I nodded slowly. You qualified because I co-signed the lease as your guarantor. I also paid the security deposit, which was $4,000 at the time. The color drained from David's face. What? Mom, I never asked you to do that. You didn't know. I handled it directly with the landlord because your credit score wasn't quite high enough on its own, and I wanted to make sure you got that apartment. You were so excited about it, and it was such a good deal. David stared at me like I just told him the sky was actually purple. But Skylar said, when we were going through our paperwork for the wedding, she said everything was in our names only. She was proud that we didn't need help from parents like some of her friends did. The pieces were falling into place, and the picture they formed made my chest tight with understanding. Skylar hadn't just been unaware of my financial involvement in their lives. She'd been actively proud of their independence from parental support, building her identity as David's wife partly on the foundation of their self-sufficiency. I never told her about the guarantor agreement, David continued, his voice barely above a whisper. I honestly forgot it existed. Does this mean you've been financially responsible for our apartment this whole time? Yes, sweetheart. And if there's an issue with the guarantor paperwork now, it's probably because I've been considering whether to continue in that role. David's fork clattered against his plate. Considering? Mom, what does that mean? I looked at my son, this man I'd raised alone, worked double shifts to support, sacrificed my own dreams to ensure he had every opportunity one could give him. The same son who'd allowed his wife to erase me from his family's life without asking a single question about my version of events. It means, David, that being a guarantor is a legal responsibility that requires trust and communication between all parties. When someone tells me to disappear forever from their life, it makes me question whether I should continue to be legally and financially connected to their decisions. The words hung in the air between us. David's face went through several expressions, from confusion to realization to something that looked like panic. Mom, you got a message telling you to disappear? From who? I pulled out my phone and showed him the text from Skylar. He read it twice, his hands trembling slightly as he held my phone. I don't understand. Skylar told me you said you needed space. That being a grandmother was bringing up too many difficult memories from when Dad left. And you wanted to step back until you felt more emotionally ready. And you believed that? David's silence was answer enough. He'd not only believed it, he'd probably felt relieved by it. One less complication in his new marriage, one less person for Skylar to feel threatened by. She said you were being very mature about recognizing your limitations, David added quietly. That not all grandparents are cut out for active involvement, and it was better to be honest about it early. I felt something cold and sharp settle in my stomach. Skylar hadn't just removed me from their lives. She'd done it in a way that made David feel good about my absence. She'd turned my elimination into evidence of my selflessness and maturity. David, in the 8 months since Matthew's baptism, how many times have you called to check on me? To see how I was doing with all these difficult memories your wife told you I was processing? His face crumpled. I thought, Skylar said you'd reach out when you were ready. That pushing you would make things worse. So you did nothing. You let your wife decide how much contact I should have with my own son and grandson, and you never once questioned whether her version of events made sense. Mom, I'm sorry. I should have called, I should have checked on you. But Skylar seemed to understand the situation better than I did, and I trusted her judgment. There it was, the core of the problem laid bare. David trusted Skylar's judgment about me more than he trusted his own knowledge of who I was as a person. His wife's assessment of my character and motivations carried more weight than 28 years of his lived experience with me as his mother. The landlord called this morning, David continued, his voice small. He said if we can't resolve the guarantor situation by the end of the month, we'll need to move out or reapply with a new deposit of $12,000. We don't have that kind of money, especially with Matthew's daycare costs and Skylar not working full-time yet. I finished my sandwich while David sat in silence, probably calculating how quickly his perfect life could unravel. When I finally spoke, my voice was calm and measured. I need to think about this situation, David. It's not just about money or legal paperwork. It's about trust, respect, and what kind of relationship we're going to have going forward. What do you mean? I mean that I won't continue to be financially responsible for a family that doesn't want me to be emotionally involved. If Skylar wants me to disappear forever, then maybe that should include disappearing from your lease agreement too. David's face went white. Mom, please. We can fix this. I'll talk to Skylar, I'll explain everything. She didn't know about the guarantor thing, she'll understand. Will she? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like your wife got exactly what she wanted. I'm out of your lives, you believe it was my choice, and everyone gets to feel good about the arrangement. The only problem is that my disappearance can't be limited to just the parts she finds inconvenient. I stood up and put on my jacket, leaving enough cash on the table to cover both our meals. David looked like he might cry, and part of me ached to comfort him the way I had when he was small and the world felt too big and scary. But I wasn't his protector anymore. I was a woman who'd finally realized that love without respect is just another form of exploitation, and I was tired of being taken advantage of by people who were supposed to care about me. Think about what you want, David. Not what Skylar wants, not what's easiest for everyone else. Think about what kind of relationship you want with your mother, and then we'll talk. As I walked out of the restaurant, leaving my son sitting alone with his untouched salad and the weight of his choices, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. I felt powerful. 3 days after my lunch with David, I sat in the office of Morrison Property Management with all the paperwork spread across the desk like evidence in a trial. Mr. Morrison, a man in his 50s with kind eyes and the patience of someone who'd dealt with family drama before, walked me through every document I'd signed 4 years ago. You have every legal right to withdraw as guarantor, Mrs. Chan, he said, using the reading glasses perched on his nose to review the fine print. The original agreement includes a clause allowing either party to terminate with 30 days written notice. However, I should warn you that this will likely result in the tenants needing to vacate or qualify independently. And if they can't qualify independently, given their current credit situation and income-to-rent ratio, along with the security deposit requirements for a new lease agreement, I'd say it's unlikely they'd be approved. He looked at me over his glasses. Are you sure this is what you want to do? This is your son we're talking about. I thought about David's face at lunch, the way he'd accepted Skylar's version of my character without question, the months of silence that had felt like emotional death. Mr. Morrison, sometimes being a good parent means letting your children experience the consequences of their choices. He nodded slowly and pulled out a fresh form. I'll need you to sign here and here. The 30-day notice period begins immediately. I'll send them the official notification tomorrow. As I signed my name, I felt the weight of 4 years of invisible support lifting from my shoulders. It wasn't revenge exactly. It was clarity. If I was going to be erased from their lives, then my erasure needed to be complete and honest, not selective and convenient. The drive home gave me time to think about timing. 30 days from today would be the 3rd week of November, right before Thanksgiving. David and Skylar would have exactly 1 month to figure out how to come up with $12,000 for a new security deposit, improve their credit scores, or find a new place to live with a toddler. I spent the rest of the week in an odd state of suspended animation, waiting for the explosion I knew was coming. It arrived on Tuesday morning in the form of 7 missed calls from David and a series of increasingly frantic text messages. "Mom, the landlord sent us a notice. Please call me back. This has to be a mistake. You wouldn't really do this to us. Skylar is crying. Matthew can sense something is wrong. Please, we need to talk." The last message arrived at 11:30 that night. "I'm coming over tomorrow after work. We need to fix this." I turned off my phone and made myself a cup of tea. For the first time in months, I slept deeply and without the dreams that had been haunting me since the baptism. David showed up at my apartment the next evening looking like he'd aged 5 years in 5 days. His hair was disheveled, his shirt wrinkled, and his hands shook slightly as he stood in my doorway. "May I come in?" I stepped aside and gestured toward the living room. He sat heavily on my couch, the same spot where he used to curl up as a child when he was sick or scared. The irony wasn't lost on me. "Mom, you have to stop this. Skylar is beside herself. She hasn't slept in 3 days, and Matthew keeps asking why Mommy is crying all the time." "And what did you tell him?" David ran his hands through his hair. "What could I tell him? That his grandmother is trying to destroy his family." The accusation hit exactly as intended, but instead of guilt, I felt a calm certainty settle over me. "Is that really what you think I'm doing? What else am I supposed to think? You're putting us out on the street because of a text message Skylar sent when she was stressed and overwhelmed." I sat down across from him, maintaining the distance between us. "David, do you remember what you told me at lunch? About how proud Skylar was that you two were independent, that you didn't need help from parents like some of her friends did." "Yes, but that was before we knew about the guarantor thing." "No, sweetheart. That was her believing something that made her feel good about herself and your marriage. She was proud of independence that didn't actually exist. She was proud of self-sufficiency that was built on my financial backing." David's face flushed. "So you're punishing her for not knowing something we never told her?" "I'm not punishing anyone. I'm making our family's financial arrangements match our emotional ones. If I'm not welcome in your lives, then I shouldn't be responsible for maintaining your lifestyle." "That's not fair, Mom. Skylar didn't know she was keeping you away from something you were paying for." I leaned forward, needing him to really hear what I was about to say. "David, your wife didn't accidentally keep me away from your family. She deliberately and systematically erased me from your lives. That text message wasn't sent in a moment of stress. It was sent after months of planning and manipulation." "What are you talking about?" I went to my kitchen drawer and pulled out a folder I'd been compiling since our lunch. Inside were printed screenshots of Skylar's social media posts, a timeline I'd created of family events I'd been excluded from, and notes from conversations with Margaret about the stories Skylar had spread about my absence. "Your wife has been working to remove me from your life since Matthew was born, maybe longer. Look at these posts from his first months. Every milestone, every family gathering, every holiday. I'm not in a single photo, David. Not one." David flipped through the pages, his expression growing more troubled with each image. "Maybe you just weren't available for these events." "I was never invited to these events. And when I tried to arrange visits, Skylar always had reasons why it wasn't a good time. Matthew was napping, or you had family plans, or she wasn't feeling well." I showed him my phone logs, the record of calls I'd made that went unanswered, the voicemails I'd left that were never returned. "I tried, David. For months I tried to be part of your family. But every attempt was blocked, redirected, or discouraged. But she told me you said you needed space." She lied. The words hung between us, simple and devastating. "She told you what she needed you to believe, so you wouldn't question my absence or feel guilty about not including me." David stared at the evidence spread across my coffee table. "This doesn't make sense. Why would she do this? What did she think she was protecting us from?" "Control, David. She wanted complete control over your family unit, and I was a threat to that control. As long as I was involved, there was someone else who had influence over you and claims on your affection. Someone whose relationship with you predated hers, and couldn't be managed or manipulated. But you're my mother. She had to know I'd always love you. I felt my heart break a little at his confusion. Sweetheart, toxic people don't eliminate love. They eliminate access. They don't make you stop caring about someone. They make it impossible for you to maintain a relationship with them. David was quiet for a long time, reading through the timeline I'd created, studying the photos where I was conspicuously absent. When he finally looked up, his eyes were red. What she did was wrong, he said quietly. But Mom, making us homeless isn't the answer. There has to be another way to work this out. There is another way. I closed the folder and set it aside. But it requires honesty from both of you about what's been happening and genuine changes in how I'm treated as part of this family. What do you want? The question I'd been waiting for. Not what did I need or what would make this go away, but what did I want? It was the first time in months that someone had asked me to articulate my own needs and desires. I want to be Matthew's grandmother, not a stranger who shares his DNA. I want to be included in family decisions that affect him, invited to birthday parties and holidays, consulted about childcare and schooling. I want my relationship with you to be between us, not filtered through Skylar's comfort level. David nodded slowly. That sounds reasonable. And I want Skylar to acknowledge what she did, not just to me but to you. She lied to you about my motivations and manipulated you into accepting my absence. If we're going to move forward as a family, that has to be addressed honestly. She'll never admit to that, Mom. Skylar doesn't apologize. She just moves forward and expects everyone else to do the same. Then you have a decision to make, David. You can continue to prioritize your wife's comfort over your mother's dignity. And you can figure out how to afford a $12,000 security deposit by the third week of November. Or you can decide that this family is going to operate differently going forward. I stood up and walked to the door, opening it for him. Think about it, sweetheart. But think quickly. You have 24 days to make this right, or you'll be making it from a different address. As David left my apartment, I could see him mentally calculating the impossibility of his situation. $12,000 they didn't have. Credit scores that hadn't improved since college. A toddler who needed stability and consistency. And a wife who was about to discover that her systematic elimination of me from their lives had eliminated their housing security as well. I closed the door and leaned against it, feeling something I'd almost forgotten how to feel. For the first time since Matthew's baptism, I felt like I mattered. Not just as a source of financial support or emergency backup, but as a person whose feelings and relationship had value. Tomorrow I knew would bring more desperate phone calls, more attempts at negotiation, more promises of change that might or might not be sincere. But tonight, for the first time in months, I felt like Helen Chen again. Not just David's mother or Matthew's grandmother, but a woman who deserved respect and honesty from the people she loved. And if they couldn't give me that, then they could learn to live without the financial foundation I'd been providing all along. The breaking point came on a Saturday morning, 18 days into the 30-day notice period. I was in my kitchen making pancakes, enjoying the quiet ritual of my weekend routine, when someone started pounding on my door with the kind of desperation that suggested emergency or complete emotional breakdown. I looked through the peephole and saw Skylar standing in my hallway, her usually perfect hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, her face blotchy and tear-stained. She was alone, which surprised me. I'd expected David to be the intermediary in any final negotiation attempts. Helen, please open the door. I know you're in there. Her voice cracked with exhaustion and something that sounded like genuine panic. We need to talk. I unlocked the door but left the chain latch engaged, opening it just wide enough to see her face clearly. Where's David? Home with Matthew. He doesn't know I'm here. Skylar wiped her nose with the back of her hand, a gesture so uncharacteristically unguarded that it made me take a step back. Please, can I come in? I'm not here to fight with you. Against my better judgment, I removed the chain and let her into my apartment. She looked around with obvious curiosity, taking in the modest furniture and family photos with an expression I couldn't quite read. This was the first time she'd ever been in my home, despite 4 years of being part of the family. Would you like some coffee? The politeness was automatic, a lifetime of hospitality training that kicked in even during personal crises. Yes, please. Skylar sat down at my kitchen table, her hands clasped together so tightly her knuckles were white. Helen, I need you to know that I never understood what David's apartment situation really was. When he told me about the guarantor thing, I was completely shocked. I poured 2 cups of coffee and sat down across from her. But you weren't shocked enough to reconsider the message you sent me at Matthew's baptism. Her face crumpled. I was angry that day. You have to understand, I felt like you were judging me, like you disapproved of how I was raising Matthew. Based on what? I barely had 5 minutes with him at the church. Based on everything. The way you looked at me when I was breastfeeding like I was doing it wrong. The suggestions you made about his sleep schedule when he was just a few weeks old. The way you kept offering to babysit when I was trying to bond with my baby. I stared at her, recognizing my own actions through the filter of new mother anxiety and insecurity. Skylar, those weren't criticisms. I was trying to be helpful, to share what I'd learned raising David. But it felt like criticism. It felt like you thought I didn't know what I was doing. Fresh tears started flowing down her cheeks. I was so scared that I was failing as a mother, and every suggestion felt like proof that you could see my failures too. The admission hung between us, raw and honest in a way that caught me off guard. I'd seen Skylar's confidence, her social media posts about the joys of motherhood, her apparent ease with all aspects of parenting. I'd never considered that it might be a performance designed to hide her own fears and insecurities. So you decided to eliminate me from the equation entirely. I thought it would be easier if I didn't have to worry about living up to your expectations, while I was still figuring everything out. Skylar wrapped her hands around her coffee mug like it was an anchor. I told myself it was temporary, just until I felt more confident. And then months went by, and temporary became permanent. It was working so well. David seemed less stressed when he wasn't trying to balance both of our needs. Matthew and I had our routines figured out. Everything felt more stable without the complications of extended family dynamics. I felt a familiar anger rise in my chest. The complications of extended family dynamics. Is that what you call a grandmother wanting to know her grandson? That's not what I meant. Skylar's voice was small, defeated. Helen, I know what I did was wrong. I know lying to David about why you stepped back was terrible. But I was trying to protect something that felt fragile and precious. By destroying something that was also fragile and precious. My relationship with my son and grandson. I didn't think about it that way. I only thought about what I needed to feel secure. The honesty in her admission was almost worse than outright malice would have been. At least malice would have suggested she understood she was hurting me. This felt more like collateral damage from her own emotional needs. Skylar, do you have any idea what these past 8 months have been like for me? Watching my grandson grow up through social media posts? Being told by my own son that I chose to step away from the family. David believed that? He believed what you told him. That I was overwhelmed by difficult memories and needed space to deal with my emotional limitations. Skylar closed her eyes, looking genuinely pained. I thought it sounded better than telling him I asked you to stay away. I thought it would hurt his feelings less if he believed it was your choice. So you made me the villain in my own erasure. You made it seem like I was too damaged and selfish to handle being a grandmother. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. The words came out in a rush, accompanied by the kind of ugly crying that can't be faked. Helen, I know I can't undo what I did, but we're going to lose our apartment. Matthew loves his room, his toys, the park across the street. I don't know how to explain to a 2-year-old why we have to leave the only home he's ever known. I watched her fall apart at my kitchen table. This young woman who'd seemed so confident and in control, now reduced to pleading for help from the person she'd tried to erase. Part of me felt vindicated. This was exactly the consequence I'd hoped for when I withdrew as guarantor. But another part of me, the part that had loved David since before Skylar existed, ached at the thought of my grandson losing his home because of adult conflicts he couldn't understand. What does David think about all this? He's trying to find solutions. He applied for a personal loan, but our debt-to-income ratio is too high because of my student loans and his car payment. He asked his old boss about borrowing against his retirement account, but it wouldn't be enough for the full deposit. And he doesn't know you're here. He'd be furious if he knew. He said we weren't going to beg you to change your mind, that we'd figure out another way. Skylar looked up at me with red, swollen eyes. But there is no other way, Helen. We've run the numbers 100 times. We can't make this work without your help. I stood up and walked to my kitchen window, looking out at the courtyard where children played while their parents watched from benches. What exactly are you asking me for? I'm asking you to give us another chance. To let me prove that I can do better, that I can include you in our family the right way. And in exchange, I continue as guarantor on your lease. Yes. I turned back to face her. What happens when you get comfortable again? When the crisis passes and you start feeling like my involvement is threatening your sense of control? That won't happen. How can you promise that? You've already proven that when you feel insecure, you're willing to lie to David and manipulate situations to get what you need. Skylar was quiet for a long moment, staring into her coffee cup. Because now I know what the consequences look like. I know that pushing you away means losing things that matter more than my comfort. Like your apartment. Like David's trust. He's barely speaking to me since he realized what I did. He keeps looking at me like he's seeing me for the first time, and he doesn't like what he sees. That information hit me harder than I'd expected. In all my planning for this confrontation, I'd focused on the financial pressure and housing insecurity. I hadn't considered how David would process the realization that his wife had been systematically lying to him for months. He's questioning everything now, Skylar continued. Every time I told him you were too busy to visit, every excuse I made for why holiday plans didn't include you, every story about you needing space. He's going back through all of it and seeing the manipulation. Good. He should see it. Helen, I think he might leave me. The words were barely a whisper, but they changed everything about our conversation. This wasn't just about housing anymore. This was about a marriage that was crumbling under the weight of revealed deceptions. Is that why you're here? To save your marriage? I'm here because I finally understand what I destroyed. Not just your relationship with Matthew, but David's relationship with you. I made him complicit in hurting his own mother, and I made him believe it was for good reasons. I sat back down at the table, studying Skylar's face for any sign that this was another performance, another manipulation designed to get what she wanted. But her raw desperation seemed genuine, and more importantly, her understanding of the actual damage seemed real. If I agreed to continue as guarantor, I have conditions. Hope flickered in her eyes. Anything. First, you tell David the complete truth about what you did and why. Not a sanitized version designed to minimize your role, but the full story of how you systematically removed me from your lives. Okay. Second, I want regular scheduled time with Matthew. Not visits that depend on your mood or convenience, but standing arrangements that happen regardless of other family dynamics. Yes, of course. Third, major decisions about Matthew's care, education, and upbringing include me in the discussion. I'm not asking for veto power, but I want to be consulted as his grandmother. Skylar hesitated for the first time. What kind of decisions? Daycare choices, medical care, educational planning. The kinds of things grandparents typically have input on in healthy families. That seems reasonable. And fourth, this can never happen again. If you start feeling insecure or threatened by my relationship with David or Matthew, you talk to me directly instead of trying to manipulate the situation behind my back. I promise. I looked at this young woman who'd caused me so much pain, who was now sitting in my kitchen making promises that might or might not hold under pressure. The smart thing would be to let them face the consequences of their choices. The satisfying thing would be to watch them struggle the way I'd struggled with isolation and rejection. But the loving thing, the thing that honored my relationship with David and my hopes for Matthew, might be to give them one more chance to get it right. I'll call Mr. Morrison on Monday and withdraw my 30-day notice. But Skylar, if you ever try to remove me from this family again, there won't be a second conversation. Do you understand? She nodded through fresh tears, reaching across the table to grab my hand. Thank you. Thank you so much. As she squeezed my fingers, I realized this wasn't victory. It wasn't revenge or justice or any of the satisfying conclusions I'd imagined. It was just the beginning of a very different kind of family dynamic, one where my place at the table was secure not because of love alone, but because of respect backed by consequence. Whether that would be enough to build something real remained to be seen. 6 months after Skylar's desperate visit to my kitchen, I was sitting on a blanket in the park watching Matthew chase bubbles while David pushed him gently toward each floating sphere. It was our third Saturday morning together, part of the new routine that had emerged from the ashes of our old family dynamics. Gamma Helen, look. Matthew's voice was clear and excited as he pointed at a particularly large bubble that seemed to hover just out of his reach. At 2.5, he was finally old enough to remember my name between visits, and hearing him say it never failed to fill my chest with warmth. I see it, sweetheart. Can you catch it? He lunged forward with the unsteady determination of a toddler, his small hands cupping air as the bubble drifted higher. David caught him as he stumbled, both of them laughing at the near miss. These Saturday mornings had become sacred time, just the three of us without the complicated dynamics that still sometimes surfaced when Skylar was present. She'd kept her promises, mostly, but rebuilding trust was proving to be a slower process than anyone had anticipated. Mom, I wanted to talk to you about Thanksgiving, David said, settling beside me on the blanket while Matthew discovered a patch of dandelions. Skylar's parents want to host this year, and they've specifically asked me to make sure you're invited. I raised an eyebrow. They asked you to make sure I'm invited? Skylar told them everything. About what she did, about the apartment situation, about how close they came to losing me. David's voice carried a weight that hadn't been there before. The heaviness of someone who'd learned difficult truths about the person he'd married. Linda called me last week to apologize for not including you more over the years. She said she'd been following Skylar's lead about family dynamics, but now she realizes how wrong that was. And how do you feel about spending Thanksgiving with Skylar's family? David was quiet for a moment, watching Matthew attempt to blow a dandelion that was already just a stem. Honestly, I'm still figuring out how I feel about a lot of things. The marriage counseling had been David's idea, suggested 3 weeks after Skylar's confession when he'd realized that their problems went deeper than housing insecurity. They attended sessions every Tuesday evening while I watched Matthew, an arrangement that had initially felt strange but had become one of my favorite parts of the week. The counselor says I have a pattern of avoiding conflict by letting other people make decisions for me, David continued. That I use Skylar's strong personality as an excuse not to advocate for what I actually wanted. And what did you actually want? My mom in my life. My son knowing his grandmother. But it was easier to accept Skylar's version of events than to question why my mother would suddenly want distance from her only grandchild. The admission stung, but it was the kind of honest pain that felt necessary for healing. David had changed over these months, becoming more assertive in ways that sometimes surprised all of us. Last month, when Skylar had suggested postponing my scheduled visit because she wasn't feeling well, David had quietly informed her that my time with Matthew wasn't dependent on her health or mood. Matthew, come show Gamma Helen the flower you found, David called out, and my grandson came running over with a slightly wilted daisy clutched in his small fist. Pretty flower for Gamma, he said solemnly, placing it in my palm with the reverence of someone presenting a precious gift. It's beautiful, Matthew. Should we take it home and put it in water? He nodded enthusiastically, then climbed into my lap with the casual affection that had taken months to develop. For a while after my return to their lives, he'd been shy around me, uncertain about this grandmother who appeared and disappeared from his world. But consistency had worked its magic, and now I was simply part of his landscape of trusted adults. There's something else I wanted to tell you, David said, his tone shifting to something more serious. Skylar and I have decided to separate for a while. I looked up from Matthew's curls, my heart jumping with alarm and something that might have been relief. When? Next month. It's not permanent, or at least we're not calling it permanent. But we both need space to figure out who we are without the patterns we've fallen into. Where will Matthew be? With me primarily. Skylar agrees that he needs stability, and my work schedule is more flexible than hers. David's hands moved restlessly through the grass beside the blanket. She's going to stay with her sister for a few months, focus on her own therapy and figuring out why she felt so threatened by sharing our family with you. The news should have felt like victory, but mostly it felt complicated. A toddler shouldn't have to navigate his parents' marital problems, and I didn't want my place in Matthew's life to be connected to the breakdown of his parents' relationship. How do you feel about it? Scared, sad, but also relieved in ways that probably make me a terrible person. David picked up a stick and drew abstract patterns in the dirt. Mom, I love Skylar. But living with her has felt like walking through a minefield for so long that I'd forgotten what it felt like to just exist without constantly monitoring her emotional temperature. That doesn't make you terrible, David. It makes you human. She's not a bad person. I need you to know that. She's just someone who got so focused on protecting what she thought she needed that she couldn't see how much damage she was causing. I nodded, understanding that David needed me to not vilify his wife even as he struggled with the consequences of her choices. People can be good people who do harmful things, especially when they're operating from fear. Matthew had discovered my car keys in my purse and was now making elaborate vroom sounds while driving them through the air. His complete absorption in his imaginary journey reminded me why we were all working so hard to get this right. There's one more thing, David said. I want you to know that whatever happens between Skylar and me, your relationship with Matthew is secure now. Not because of apartment leases or financial arrangements, but because you're his grandmother and he needs you in his life. The words I've been waiting months to hear finally spoken aloud. Not conditional love based on convenience or circumstance, but the acknowledgement of my inherent place in my grandson's world. Thank you for saying that. I should have said it a long time ago. I should have said it the day Matthew was born, instead of letting Skylar manage our family relationships like some kind of social coordinator. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching Matthew's elaborate car adventure unfold across the blanket. Other families moved through the park around us, parents chasing toddlers, grandparents pushing swings, the ordinary magic of weekend family time that I'd missed so desperately during those months of exile. David, can I ask you something? Of course. During all those months when Skylar was telling you I needed space, did you ever doubt her story? Even for a moment? David's face flushed red. Once. It was Matthew's first birthday, and Skylar was posting all these pictures of the party. I realized afterward that she'd never even mentioned inviting you, and when I asked about it, she said you'd probably find the celebration overwhelming. But you didn't call to check on me. I almost did. I picked up the phone 3 different times that night. But Skylar seemed so certain about what was best for everyone, and I was tired of feeling like I was disappointing someone no matter what I chose. So you chose to disappoint me instead of her. Yes. And I'll regret that for the rest of my life. The honesty between us felt different now, cleaner somehow. We were talking about painful truths without the cushion of politeness or the fear of making things worse. It was the kind of conversation I'd wanted to have with David for years, but had never known how to initiate. Mom, I know I can't undo the last year. But I want you to know that losing you from our lives was the worst thing that happened to our family. Worse than the apartment crisis, worse than the marriage problems. Matthew lost 8 months of knowing his grandmother, and I lost 8 months of watching you love him. I reached over and squeezed David's hand. We're here now, sweetheart. That's what matters. Look, Gamma. Big car. Matthew had discovered a Leaf that apparently made an excellent vehicle for his key car convoy. That is a very big car, Matthew. Where is it going? To Gamma's house for pancakes. I laughed, remembering that I'd promised him pancakes next week when he came for his first overnight visit. The idea of having my grandson sleep over, of making him breakfast and reading bedtime stories, still felt almost too good to be true. We should probably head back soon, David said, glancing at his watch. I promised Skylar we'd be back by noon, and I don't want to start any unnecessary conflicts. As we packed up our blanket and gathered Matthew's various treasures from the playground, I felt a deep sense of completeness that had been missing from my life for so long. Not because everything was perfect, but because I finally knew where I stood. I wasn't a visitor in my own family anymore, tolerated based on other people's comfort levels. The drive back to David's apartment gave me time to think about how much had changed since that devastating text message at Matthew's baptism. I'd learned that sometimes love isn't enough to maintain relationships, that respect and honesty are just as essential. I'd learned that boundaries enforced with consequences are more effective than boundaries maintained with hope alone. Most importantly, I'd learned that my worth as a mother and grandmother wasn't determined by other people's ability to recognize it. I mattered because I mattered, not because everyone else agreed that I did. When we pulled up to David's building, Skylar was waiting on the front steps with a suitcase beside her. She looked nervous but determined, the expression of someone about to make a difficult but necessary journey. Mama! Matthew ran to her with the uncomplicated joy of a child who didn't understand adult complications. Hi, baby boy. Did you have fun with Daddy and Gamma Helen? We saw bubbles. And flowers. And big cars made of leaves. Skylar smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from her in months. That sounds wonderful. She looked up at me as David carried Matthew inside to wash his hands before lunch. Helen, I know I don't have the right to ask this, but will you look after them while I'm gone? Not just Matthew but David too. He's going to try to handle everything alone, but he's going to need help. Of course I will. They're my family. I know that now. I'm sorry it took almost losing everything for me to understand. As she hugged Matthew goodbye and kissed David on the cheek, I realized that this wasn't the ending I'd imagined when I first read that cruel text message. There was no dramatic confrontation. No satisfying moment of vindication where everyone acknowledged my righteousness. Instead, there was just the quiet satisfaction of knowing that I'd stood up for myself when it mattered, that I'd refused to accept mistreatment, even from people I loved, and that I'd created space for authentic relationships to develop. Later that evening, after I'd helped David give Matthew his bath and read him 3 bedtime stories, I drove home to my small apartment feeling more at peace than I had in years. My phone buzzed with a text from David. Thank you for not giving up on us, even when we gave up on you. I smiled and put the phone aside. Tomorrow was Sunday, which meant pancakes with Matthew and maybe a quiet afternoon teaching him to help me bake cookies. Next week, he'd have his first sleepover at my house, and I'd finally get to experience the grandmother relationship I'd fought so hard to protect. The apartment that had felt so empty during my months of exile now felt like a sanctuary. A place where I could be completely myself without monitoring anyone else's comfort level or emotional temperature. I poured myself a glass of wine and sat on my small balcony, looking out at the city lights and thinking about the future. I was 61 years old, and I just learned that it's never too late to demand the respect you deserve. That love without boundaries isn't actually love at all, it's just enabling. That sometimes the best gift you can give someone is the consequences of their own choices. For the first time since Matthew's baptism, I felt genuinely free. Not because I'd won some kind of battle, but because I'd remembered who I was underneath all the roles and relationships and expectations. I was Helen Chun and I mattered. And that was enough.